Larson from the School of Sustainability and the School of Urban Planning. So over to you, Kelli.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you all for being here. This is being recorded, hence the microphone, but I speak really loudly, so hopefully I'm not going to boom you out of the room with this. We have a saying in my family, whoever's the loudest is the rightest. So that's where I get my teaching voice, essentially. But yeah, I'm delighted to present to you today. And what I'm going to do is kind of deliver a seminar talk that I've developed over the last 5 or so years that focuses on earlier research that I was really engaged in the first 5 to 10 years I was here. So this is actually my 21st year. I know I don't look like I could have been here for 20 years, but this is my 21st year here. So it really is featuring research from the starting point of my assistant professorship all the way through to some ongoing research. But what I'm going to present to you is sort of 2 research vignettes under the umbrella of landscape sustainability with a focus on residential land systems and thinking about drivers and constraints of residential land change and implications for environmental as well as social outcomes in urban environments. And so, as many of you know, my early work was really focused on issues of water conservation and demand management in urban contexts. And through that work, I really shifted towards thinking about multi-objective planning in the landscape analysis and management realm. And so I'll highlight some key findings over several publications in that paper, and then I'll shift to, and most of that work, really all of that work is centered in metropolitan Phoenix because of funding associated with DCDC and the CAP-LTER and other local research projects. And then the second research vignette is going to pivot, thinking about gardening for wildlife or habitat provisioning in residential and urban landscape systems. And time permitting, I'll kind of highlight how these themes in this research are continuing on into research that I'm working on more actively today. So I'm not going to get into a whole lot of nuts and bolts of theories or methods or specific analyses, but I kind of want to tell more of stories and their implications for landscape sustainability and kind of my approach to thinking and also some hints of my approach to teaching as well. But why I've worked a lot in residential land systems is because they're pervasive in urban areas. And as such, they provide the landscapes in which people interact with the natural world in their everyday lives. And in aggregate, what people do in these their residential yards or landscapes, that is the landscape composition and management, aggregates up to affect things like water consumption and also other dynamics like heat outcomes and actually habitat provisioning that can enhance biodiversity, as I'll show you. And in the global north, in particular in the US, a lot of our housing stock is dominated by single family residential homes. And so a lot of this work is really centered in these kinds of landscapes where people live and interact with vegetation and other biotic elements of the urban environment in their front, back, side yards, and within the broader context of their neighborhoods. And so how I got into this is because these outdoor landscapes require irrigation in our semi-arid desert environment. And accordingly, they consume a significant amount of water. So about 2/3 of water in municipal areas is spent on outdoor irrigation. And if you slice the pie in a different way, 2/3 is used by residents, residential land uses. And so a lot of this work was thinking about the transition that we've seen away from these mesic lawns, which require higher water inputs, more irrigation, to what I'll refer to as xeric climate adaptive alternatives, which are also increasingly pervasive, especially since the 80s and 90s throughout the region. And so one of the themes is, you know, what's driving this what has been driving this landscape shift, and also what has not driven this landscape shift, as you'll see. And in addition to being water consumptive, lawns have a really bad rap in the media and also conservation communities. And so you've seen a lot of popular as well as scholarly books written about the environmental concerns related to high input and single species lawns that diminish biodiversity, increase fertilizer use, increase water use, and have a variety of other negative outcomes. And so in recent years, we've seen a rise of these alternatives. And so the kind of question is like, what's going on in terms of what's driving the rise of these alternatives and what are potential social and ecological impacts of them? And I've worked, again, mostly in kind of the top realm, little bit in stormwater gardens, but mostly thinking about lawns and low impact lawns, as well as these xeric yards that are water conservation oriented, as well as climate adaptive, and then also thinking about wildlife gardens as well. And so this is a framework that we've published that I've used a lot in my work with ecologists in particular. And here, I just as an overview, right, the overarching question is like, what's driving land management decisions, and then what are the intending outcomes ecologically, as well as in terms of a variety of ecosystem services and disservices that come out of the landscape composition, as well as their management. And then also thinking somewhat about how those might feed back in terms of legacy effects has been one theme in my research, but in other ways potentially to affect people and the decisions they're making, as well as focus on these sort of multi-geographic levels of drivers at the individual scale or household scale, and then also at the neighborhood scale and municipal and broader forces that might be acting upon residents to influence their decision-making in their home landscapes. So no jingle here today, but this is probably a familiar face to many. And Jingle's work in landscape sustainability has influenced my own thinking quite a bit. And Jingle has defined landscape sustainability as the capacity of landscapes to consistently provide long-term ecosystem services that are essential for maintaining and improving well-being. And so I've kind of infused Jingle's thinking about landscape sustainability with that of Joan Nassauer, who is a very prominent landscape architect out of University of Michigan. And she's talked a lot about the social sustainability of landscapes, which she has defined as ecologically beneficial practices that elicit sustained human attention over time. So working in wetlands was Joan's kind of original work in this area. And the idea is, how do you get landscapes or ecosystems that might not be seen as desirable and beneficial to human-dominated systems to accept them and even appreciate them? And so as a landscape architect, she talks a lot about cues of care as specific landscape design elements that can improve the aesthetic and overall appreciation of what might otherwise be seen as sort of messy, disorderly, unsafe ecosystems. And so combining these perspectives, and so I am a human environment geographer. I study the inherent interactions between people and the environment, both natural and built. But I am also fundamentally a social scientist who works, as you'll see, in very interdisciplinary contexts. And so infusing these ecological and social perspectives, I kind of think of landscape sustainability as the ability of landscapes to maximize environmental benefits, minimize negative impacts, or in other words, increase ecosystem services, decrease ecosystem disservices, while sustaining human appreciation and maintenance over time. And especially in human-dominated systems, but arguably across the world, the idea here is if people don't want it and they're not going to accept it and they're not going to do it, then you could have all the ecological knowledge in the world about impacts, and what are we going to do about it? And so how do we work with people to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, and then tailor strategies to that empirical evidence in creating sustainability solutions or landscape planning and management strategies. Okay, so here I'm entering into my first vignette. Again, I'm not going to go into details about methods, but generally this work is predominantly based on quantitative analysis of survey data, but also infuses interviews to some extent as well, largely funded through the CAP-LTR and other NSF grants. And so just a little bit of background if you're not as familiar with the Phoenix region, but the region has long time been promoted as an oasis that is distinct from the desert. And these are actually slogans used in boosterism campaigns to draw residents, immigrants, and also to draw tourists to the region. So this idea of doing away with the desert, and also the desert is a myth, has been very pervasive in kind of the public discourse about the region and promoting the area as an oasis that is separate from the desert. And we see this across, especially in historic neighborhoods and historic parts of the urban fabric, where lawns and water fountains and really lush, landscape features are quite dominant. And so this is the backdrop for much of my research, and I'll get to why this is important in a minute. But basically, we have seen, and we do know, again, since the 1980s, 90s, really, a rise in, and this is just from survey data, but basically you're seeing an increased xerification of people's yards. And I'll talk about basically what's been driving and constraining kind of these changes over time. And in giving this talk, I like to basically debunk common assumptions and myths about why the changes have occurred. And I see this in media reports to this day. I hear this from conservation managers to this day. I hear this from my dad, who does not accept my research, apparently. But right, and so I like to think back to Denise Locke, who was a really important mentor for me in my early days as a researcher, who said, Kelly, is that an assumption or a hypothesis? And what I tell my students now is turn your assumptions into hypothesis and actually test them. And so one of the ideas is, right, it's environmental values and concerns at the individual level that are getting people to adopt these low input, biodiverse sort of landscapes. So if we just change their values, if we just keep people to concern, then we'll see the changes in the behavior. The other idea is that it's individual residents' preferences that are really changing what we're seeing in the landscape. And the third is it's that all you Midwesterners and Easterners who love your grass are bringing it to the valley. And the reality is none of these things are true, again, at the individual resident level. And so hopefully the data is persuasive enough for you. But this is just some data from a survey sort of demonstrating that people, and this is the case for both landscape preferences that residents hold, as well as the landscapes they report having in their actual yards. This trend holds out over multiple samples of multiple peer-reviewed journal articles. I would say that's test, retest, validation there. That it is the long-term Phoenicians that have and want grass more so than the newcomers. So next time you or somebody else says, oh, well, it's the Midwesterners bringing grass to the valley, tell them, no, actually, that might have been what's going on in the 1950s and the 1960s when the region was booming, but it is absolutely not the dynamic that we're seeing today. It's the newcomers that are really embracing the more xeric environment and also and we see that borne out in preferences. And we see in qualitative research with interviews, people saying things like that just to kind of further explain what might be going on in people's decision processes. But it's sort of like, I get sick of the desert. The desert belongs out there. And these sorts of statements. So you can see, I call this like the oasis effect mentality of like the long timers in particular, very much think of the region along the lines of these boosterism slogans and are othering the desert as something that's out there that's distinct from my city, from our residential and urban landscapes. So the second assumption turned into hypotheses is that it's values that are driving people to make these changes. And again, at the individual scale of residents. And this has been shown by other work by Paul Robbins and in lots of other contexts, is like values don't really always translate into action. I think it's something we fundamentally know, but still tend to use these kinds of solutions despite evidence. But this is just example data showing that people with the strongest environmental values actually are more likely to manage mesic lawns. And, you know, and the relationship here is sort of nonlinear. It's the people with those best of both worlds oasis, so some grass, some xeric, that are the most anthropocentric, whereas people with lawns as well as more xerics tend to be more biocentric in their value orientations and in their worldviews. And we've seen evidence, and so another evidence of this is showing here that basically people with stronger environmental values are watering, are irrigating their landscapes more frequently than people that have more anthropocentric or less environmentally strong values. And the way we've described this or think about this is at least partly through the social construction of nature, whereas people actually think about lawns as nature. I know it might hurt some ecologists, especially native plant people, to think this. But so what we see is quotes about people saying, I like to tend to nature, steward nature with my kids when they're talking about managing their lawns and their local landscapes. Another way to explain this is that people that are more concerned and interested in the environment are more hobbyists and enthusiasts. So then they manage their yards more intensively. And then the outcomes are such that those that have stronger environmental values are actually using more water, using more chemicals, which then in turn have negative environmental outcomes as well. And the reality is while people will say environmental or water concerns are important, if you ask them in your decision processes, what are you thinking about? They do say this oftentimes. But a variety of research that I've worked on and others have worked on is the reality is that other social priorities trump environmental priorities. And those priorities are especially in the realms of aesthetic appreciation and in the realm of leisure. And when we talk about leisure, we see really strong priorities for low maintenance yards, as well as yard designs and management that are tailored to people's forms of leisure pursuits in the realm of what they engage in for recreation and enjoyment. And so this sort of explains the disconnect between sort of the attitude, behavior, value, action sort of disconnect that we see a lot in human environment research. And then the other thing that we've seen is that, the idea that, it's changing preferences that are changing people's yard. And we have data on that sort of assumption to indicate that's not necessarily all of what's going on. Because while existing yards have changed over time towards xeric, increasingly xeric landscapes. We see preferences have stayed the same. And we also know that existing yards don't always match people's preferences. And in a paper read by Megan Wheeler, a PhD, former PhD student, we actually showed there's a kind of a latent demand for grass, at least there was 5 to 10 years ago, wherein people wanted more grass than they actually have. And so that's important because if people are able to change their landscape, they might be actually changing them back to grass rather than shifting towards more xeric yard alternatives. So there's essentially evidence, a few pieces of evidence that seem to suggest that it's really not individual preferences that are changing people's yards. And so then you ask, well, what is changing the yards then? Because we do see this aggregate shift historically across the landscape. And it's essentially these broader scale forces that are being made and have essentially led to the landscapes that we've inherited as modern day residents of the metropolitan Phoenix area. And there's work that's talked a lot about the importance of decisions that developers are making. And associated with that, the changes in the horticultural industry that are now providing the plants, as well as changes at that bigger scale among, for example, landscape architects who, along with the environmental movement, started changing more naturalistic yard designs, started thinking more about environmentally friendly, low impact yard designs, shifting away from the industrial lawn norm as kind of the preferred landscape in people's homes. And so it seems like it's these broader scale forces that are really boiling down to affecting the broader scale landscape changes we see. And a lot of the common assumptions that we're making when tested as hypotheses are not being borne out in terms of the individual scale drivers that are really affecting decisions that are associated with landscape change. And so I've also written about this in a recent book chapter that I just thought I'd mention, that's sort of emphasizing the multi-scalar forces that are affecting, influencing and constraining, and importantly, the oftentimes not evidence-based assumptions that people are doing conservation and educational programming on that are actually not really very impactful in terms of what's driving people to make the changes. So sort of overall, in summary, I always advocate, again, especially for my students, is to think carefully about what's driving people to do what they're doing, because it's oftentimes not what we would assume or think it is in a more intuitive sense. And so be careful about the assumptions you make when you're designing strategies and interventions for conservation change, especially those targeted at residents or the household scale. And I wanted to just emphasize too, I'm going to skip through this clearly, some strategies that I talk about in my work and pinpoint people to Mackenzie Moore's community-based social marketing, which is very much an evidence-based strategy for shifting behaviors towards sustainability. And so if you're not familiar with that, they have a great website and a book it's very pragmatic, but it's also very much grounded in behavioral theory as well. And so shifting to part 2 of my talk on wildlife gardening, I'm going to be talking about work that was done in Phoenix, but also in 6 cities presented here on this map, and 2 rounds of macrosystems bio projects with Peter Groffman as the lead. And again, this is based on surveys as well as interdisciplinary research that we've done. And here, right, it's what is driving and constraining people to garden for wildlife. And what we do see in some of the survey work is that although most people across our survey do have lawns, it is not just the monolithic single species of grass, that they're managing lawns in conjunction with a variety of other plants. And we also found that people are reporting to the tune of 40 to 50% plans to increase their adoption of features that support birds, pollinators, and other wildlife in their home landscapes. And so this, I'm going to share with you results from this work that's basically showing like what's driving and constraining people in terms of the likelihood of adopting these kinds of yard features into the future. And this is another graph showing people's priorities from survey data. And so again, you see that same theme, which sample and sample and sample and sample over and over again. It's aesthetics and leisure priorities that dominate. So if we don't meet the aesthetic and leisure priorities that are driving people's decisions, by and large, we're not going to really be able to achieve the more middling or moderate priorities that are related to biodiversity outcomes. And so this kind of harkens back to thinking about, right, the social sustainability of landscape change. And I'll get back to that at the end of this vignette. But what we find is that one of the main factors that is driving or affecting people's decisions to garden for wildlife are low maintenance priorities. Specifically, if your priority, which is the dominant priority among the American people who are managing yards, if that's your priority, then you're going to be, it's going to limit you. You're going to be less likely to adopt wildlife-friendly gardens. But it's the gardening's, the hobbyists, the enthusiast gardeners, those are the ones, right, who are enjoying being out there in the landscape and managing their yards, who are the the current adopters and the most likely adopters of these yards. And although we do see some connections to environmental concerns and aesthetics, they're not nearly as influential as in a multivariate context, in particular, as these low maintenance, basically as these leisure pursuits and affecting what it is that people are doing. And then we do see a signal, which is consistent with behavioral theory, in terms of there are some people that are concerned about wildlife coming into their yards, and they have an active intention of deterring wildlife from coming into their yards, which is important for managing for human-wildlife coexistence. And then we also see, right, the intentionality to attract and support wildlife is also particularly important. But so when we talk about management implications, Joan, we can return back to Joan Nassauer's idea of cues of care and thinking about the things that architects know and that social scientists have shown that are going to visually appeal to people, to get them to value and appreciate and maintain these landscapes that are perhaps more naturalistic, more biodiverse, have higher ecological function in terms of like linear and curved features, containers and strategic spacing to maintain lines of sight to buildings or windows or pathways, and of course colors, and whether in flowers or different colored plants are just some simple examples of what those cues of care look like at the landscape level. And then added to that, where my work has really showed not just the importance of aesthetics, but the importance of leisure opportunities, especially low maintenance priorities, right? So conservationists and folks who are really trying to encourage pollinator gardens or provisioning of habitat for birds in cities really should be thinking about marketing and messaging and practical tips to do these things, and right, because they kind of want to do them, but if they're not easy, they're not going to do them. And so what are those sort of strategies and tips that might be easier and less time consuming in terms of native plants, right? Because they're adapted to local landscapes, they might be a better option. Slow growing plants that you don't have to prune regularly. Mesquite trees can grow 8 feet a year, and that's a lot of money or a lot of labor put into maintaining those trees. As an example, obviously climate adapted plants, as those that are easier to use, are going to require less irrigation, and bird boxes as non-vegetative strategies that may be lower maintenance, are just a few examples there. And so I wanted to just share with you very briefly some work that's more in an interdisciplinary context. And so we've done some work that's linking these different landscape types with biodiversity outcomes for plant communities and bird communities, working with ecologists in particular. And we've also done some work, which I'm not going to highlight today, linking management priorities to actual plant biodiversity outcomes in terms of different types of plants with different types of traits associated with them. And a lot of this work has been enabled, and a lot of my work in the interdisciplinary realm of social ecological research has been done through co-located sampling designs, which we do in the CAP-LTR, where we're collecting, for example, survey data in neighborhoods that we're also doing bird community surveys in, or vegetation community surveys in. And just briefly, work by my colleague and friend Susanna Lehrman and our postdoc Desiree Narango from this project showed higher bird community turnover in wildlife certified guards. So the National Wildlife Federation certifies wildlife habitat. And so we compared those to other types of yards, including different kinds of lawns, just to be brief on methods. And through that work, we were able to document basically significantly high biodiversity as measured by community turnover in the wildlife garden yards compared to lawns. And this work was also demonstrated by Padu, Kubinos, and colleagues that showed a similar trends for plant biodiversity in yards. And this work on wildlife gardening was recently published in a series of blogs with the Arizona Wildlife Federation. And so this is some of the work that I do with the Sustainability Undergraduate Research Experience program with this group of 4 undergrad students who then became REUs with the CAP-LTR. And through that work, they helped basically develop some science communication materials with Arizona Wildlife Federation, wherein they were putting, we created a series of blogs sort of on the social and ecological dynamics of wildlife gardening in their increasing push to kind of have habitat provisioning as a part of their programming and as a part of what they're doing as a conservation organization. And this research is still alive and well in my research agenda. And so I continue to work on this wildlife gardening research. And one of the things that we're kind of thinking about and working on now is like this idea of paradoxical stewardship, which I've already sort of mentioned in terms of avid gardeners potentially using more water and other inputs in their yards compared to others, despite their higher environmental values and good intentions. And so, but what we're really kind of exploring now is how habitat provisioning in residential landscape may be resulting in social ecological traps. For example, do people that are engaging in these behaviors also tend to use pesticides and herbicides more often? And is there a higher incidence of things like domestic predators, AKA outdoor cats, who could potentially, right? So you're drawing the birds in and then you're creating a problem for the birds. And so we're continuing to do this. We're also looking at some models with a new CAP postdoc that's coming in that's going to be looking at also effects and kind of feedbacks on human well-being, because there's been some research that shows positive outcomes and kind of creating a positive feedback loop that's encouraging people to continue to garden and invest in these outcomes. So my most recent, so I transitioned intentionally away from water research for a while into this more multi-objective landscape research space, focusing on wildlife garden issues of biological conservation. And then that got me into really thinking more about human-wildlife interactions. And so this is the a current project. Survey is underway. Last time I checked, the end of 1,284 across 4 cities. Very excited about this data set. But this project is using UN camera trap data on predicted occupancy of especially coyotes and raccoons, and thinking about how the spatial distribution of coyotes and raccoons and associated sort of habitat features and other landscape features are affecting people's experiences of wildlife in the 4 cities shown on the map. And so we're really engaging in with survey work, with camera trap, habitat occupancy modeling data, are trying to understand the social ecological dynamics that are being played out with human-wildlife interactions in heterogeneous landscapes within and across diverse cities. And 2 of the main kind of frameworks that we're using is the framework of the human-wildlife coexistence, and then also the One Health framework. There's some focus on issues of disease transmission in this project, but a lot of work for like risk perception and sort of risk analyses associated with this project. And then more recently, so now I'm finally returning to my water roots, which has been super exciting because I've been out of the business for the better part of 10 years, focusing on these other types of research questions. But a project with my colleague Dao-Chin Tong, who's a GIS scientist, spatial analyst, got a project from Impact Water Grant here in GOC. And here we're actually this next week, the next couple of weeks, we're holding workshops with water conservation folks, urban greening folks, heat mitigation folks, et cetera, to essentially co-identify and map different types of turf grass with different kinds of characteristics and different kinds of land use contexts, to prioritize if we are going to replace lawns for water savings, what do we want to replace, and then what water savings and other outcomes are impacted by that. And then Dao-Chin and our PhD student, Qinan Zhu, are going to be do spatial like mapping and modeling to understand and estimate water savings under different scenarios of change. And in addition to thinking about removal, we'll also be thinking about where do we want to maintain, oops, there's a typo on that, but where do we want to maintain turf grass? Because turf grass has some recreational value, right? Turf grass is not all bad. It has recreational value. It has potential to mitigate heat, especially with trees are on it. And work actually by Diane Pataki and Lisa Litvik have shown that there are great efficiency gains when you have trees in lawns. And so basically, how do you manage turf grass to enhance multiple environmental functions and outcomes? And then where do you have low functioning but high water use turf grass that should be kind of targeted for removal? And Stelios and Hallie and Sarah have a sister project that's complementary to this one in Scottsdale that we've been collaborating some on. And then we'll deliver back to the community a digital dashboard where they can play with the levers and kind of look at if we're, if we change these kinds of turf grass, what are the water saving outcomes, et cetera. Yeah, so that I just wanted to present some references for the bulk of the work that I've presented here for today. Happy to provide any more details, papers, et cetera, with anyone that might be interested in this work. But otherwise, I'll stop there.
So thank you, Kelly, for such an interesting presentation. Thank you. So we have time for questions. So yeah, if you have a question.
Some talk. Thank you, Kelly. Oh,
I can hear you, but
hear me on line. Another one right there. Hello. Oh, that's better. Okay, thank you so much. That was an awesome talk. I'm so interested in the intersection between the water work and the wildlife friendly yards because it seems like there's this potential to take advantage of all this turf grass removal that's happening to get more wildlife friendly yards. And one thing that we found, but I'm curious in your research, it seems like people not knowing what to do once they remove turf grass is a barrier. It's like we tell people lawns are bad and they take out the lawns and then they're intimidated by having to design some other kind of yard.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, do you find that? And can we give them wildlife friendly designs, as a way to alleviate their concerns about not knowing what to do and not knowing how to garden once they remove their turf grass?
yeah, I think that what I would call procedural knowledge, I want to do it, but I don't know how to do it, is super duper important. And so I think working with master gardeners and horticultural communities and nurseries to have basic designs that are kind of simple and easy, but high value. So the DBG has their monarch boxes, for example, where it's a basic set of plants. So some folks are doing this, but it's the basic set of plants that would be good for monarch butterflies, which are now endangered. And so it's a particular focus. So I think strategies like that could be spot on. And yeah, keeping them simple and easy to maintain and just having, it's almost there's a lot of plant guides, but Casca just actually came out with a pretty comprehensive guide, but I think it's important to keep them simple and also vary them, right? Because what appeals to one person is not going to appeal to others. Some people want to attract bees. If they're allergic, they might not. So thinking about a variety of different designs that prioritize different priorities across heterogeneous people, I think is really important. I think the other thing that's difficult is it's expensive. As somebody who took out turf and replaced it, and the rebate rates, so a lot of cities are providing rebates, but they don't cover the entire cost of the conversion. And I think the labor issues. So I think there's a lot of different programs that could be helpful in thinking about can you get community groups that help bring the capacity in terms of the labor. And then can you have simplistic landscape designs that are kind of formulaic for different kinds of people and what they're looking for, to sort of simplify the process and make it, so it's you could pick among the options and then you don't have to do all the planning yourself.
And then policy wise, is it possible to get the water districts and the cities that are doing turf grass to get involved in this, to require that people meet certain criteria when they plant a new garden in replace of their turf grass? Sometimes it's a free for all. It's just do whatever you want. You can have all gravel once you remove your turf grass.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if Sarah has any thoughts on that.
Cities these days require a certain amount of shade, a percentage of the foreign plant, vegetation replacing the grass. So there's a percentage, and a lot of cities are limiting artificial turf as a replacement. The difficulty is enforcing that. You know,
Yeah.
cities are not staffed up to have inspectors go around and measure with the bushes or
Yeah, the follow-up is a challenge. And then the cities are just, cities in metropolitan Phoenix, they don't want to tell people what to do. So we're not going to see those being borne out in regulations. But I think in suggestions. And I think the guidelines, I believe, Sarah, is that like, it's like landscapers putting in the landscapes more so than necessarily the individual residents through the conversion programs. And so again, that kind of harkens back, well, and it harkens back to the importance of working with landscape developers, which no, I have not done, but I would love to pursue that inquiry. I had some students a few years ago try to break into the landscape developing community. And so my next step is thinking about the horticultural industry, because I think, and like master gardeners and those kind, getting involved more with those kinds of entities, because I think there's going to be more bandwidth there. But certainly I think that because I think the cities want, like they have opinions about, like they don't want artificial turf grass, for example, like a lot of the professional planners, but the city councils don't want to regulate what they can do. And so there's some political dynamics there. But I think providing the toolkits to the like municipal planners would go a long way to having resources then to provide to the residents that want to do these things, and making it easier, making it more straightforward, and then maybe building some of the capacity in there to actually make the changes.
So thank you.
This was just really fantastic to see this all together. Really great talk. I had a question whether you've done much work at the municipal level, like talking to kind of the planners and what they're expecting from residents. And I'm particularly with the wildlife. I'm interested whether, because I know people get cited, you haven't mowed your lawn, your grass is too high, to what extent there's that interface between, I mean, I know that's why the wildlife, like designation is kind of like a signal, look, we're, this is intentional. But I just wonder what city policies have been and whether there's any kind of normative change there that's happening or needs to happen, to kind of be open to some of the, I think you said, like the messiness of some of the wildlife habitat.
Yeah, so in my experience, and I have another related paper that was looking at city codes, basically, which are basically all the regulations across cities in the 6-city study. And what we found through that qualitative work is that there is not a lot about wildlife. There's like certain things like the weed ordinance is a big one. And then the landscape guidelines that Sarah mentioned, where it's at the developer level that you have to have a minimum amount of trees or types of vegetation when you're installing new landscapes. And so that's kind of what we see, but I think there's so much attention, like here it's all about water conservation and heat mitigation. And so there's not a lot of conversations that I'm seeing being had about biodiversity provisioning. And then of course, in like the north and eastern cities, not so much heat mitigation, but stormwater management and water quality tend to be the dominant considerations. And so I just don't think, and we're seeing this too in this new diocese grant, that the cities, some cities like Chicago fields calls about wildlife complaints, for example, but it's very reactive and they're not very, and you see a lot of lip service to biodiversity and conservation and protected areas, but not in kind of the land sharing approach that's focused on residential landscapes and neighborhoods. Having said that, I think one of the things that the National Wildlife Federation and the Arizona Wildlife Federation are doing to encourage municipalities to take, like their Tempe mayor just took the Monarchs pledge, and there's like certain pledges which then potentially can encourage, and well, and part of it is incorporating these kinds of designs into public landscapes, and like demonstration areas and these kinds of things. But that could help potentially infiltrate then into local communities through at least resource provisioning of like, how do you do this? And if I'm a resident, like, do you have resources for me to enable me to do this? But yeah, I think wildlife, yeah, habitat provisioning and like, I think it's such a land sparing approach that has been dominant in this region in the US, where it's like you protect the parks and the areas, and those are for wildlife. But Susanna Lehrman has written, we wrote a paper that's sort of talking about the value of residential landscapes, especially because of their pervasiveness, in especially providing habitat for birds and pollinators, especially in urban settings, where you're not going to be providing habitat for large mammals and carnivores necessarily. But yeah, I think this is a space, but you do, like in Portland, Oregon, they have tons of efforts to do that. So I just don't think wildlife and habitat provisioning is just on the minds of the local governments here as much as and somewhat understandably, right? Water conservation and heat mitigation, especially here.
Time for other questions.
Hi, Kelli. Thank you for the talk. From the first half of your presentation, I think you said that environmental valuation, and there's a discrepancy between environmental valuation and decision making. And in equilibrium, the environmental valuation would be equal to price. And so that would suggest that then price isn't driving the decision making. And I was wondering why there would be a discrepancy between environmental valuation, price, and the ultimate decision making.
So so just to clarify, when I was talking about the environmental values, those are kind of people's environmental value and orientations, not valuation. They're like economic valuation of the environment. Oh, okay. Yeah.
I see.
I think cost is definitely, as I mentioned before, is a prohibitive factor, especially because it takes quite a bit of money to convert wholesale a lawn to, I mean, the gravel alone, if that's the most dominant alternative, is a pretty penny. Not to mention the hours of shoveling that rock across the landscape. Not something I want to spend my Saturdays and Sundays doing. But yeah, so yeah, I haven't done a lot of work with economy. I have in the past, but yeah, there hasn't been a lot of economic dynamics in this particular line of research. But I think it's important, and I think the biggest thing is it takes a lot of money to convert and then it's like, is that want to convert your landscape, or do you want to, remodel your kitchen, And I think the salience of like where homeowners are putting our investments and what that means for the accumulation of wealth is a factor that play there. Was there? I didn't see anyone.
You and I did.
Yeah.
Working. Okay. So on that point, something that I've been wondering about, I'm new to the area, and I'm house sitting a house that's in the flood irrigation neighborhoods. And I'm just wondering I've been wondering whether house prices are higher, same house, one's in the flood irrigation, one's not, whether those have a higher value, whether they're higher prices, because, so what's that premium because of the fact that they have access to that flood irrigation water, and that therefore can have nice, grasses and trees and things like that. Because I know that people it seems to be a desirable neighborhood because of the access to water. I just didn't know if you knew anything or if anyone's done anything.
That's an interesting, I know, I wish Josh was here or any other economists. I haven't seen Sarah.
But that may be driven by the fact that it's part of the older central core more than the premium from water availability.
Yeah, that was my sense, is that there would be.
You could control for that in like a econometric study. Yeah.
Interesting is looking at the neighborhood. I think by and large you'll find, and I say this as a longtime resident of one of those neighborhoods, that when those houses are turned over to new owners, the flood irrigation often is the first thing to go. Or remodel in favor of
Interesting. Yeah.
water sprinkler systems.
It'd be interesting to, anyway, an idea.
Yeah, and then there's a lot of interesting questions, I think, surrounding that because, right, like the maturity and the lushness of the vegetation, which is historically dependent on the flood irrigation, I would hypothesize would maybe be more of the signal that's affecting the home sale prices. And you do the heat mitigation effect if you can just walk through and feel it. But I do know Lisa Litvick is also doing some field work on this. She measures like water uptake in plants and is a former postdoc of Diane's. But I know she's in the works, like in the process of talking about doing field work in those flood irrigation yards. And I know from talking to the city planner folks, one of the concerns about switching, not necessarily flood irrigation, but switching out the lawns is then the historic trees are kind of being also fed by the flood irrigation. But yeah, there are policies to get rid of the flood irrigation. So if you have it, you can keep it, but once you get rid of it, you can't get it back.
No, you actually,
Or is that not?
you always have the right to restore your flood irrigation.
Oh, I thought they were phasing that out.
Lose it situation.
And wasn't that used to be the
That's
case?
greatly misunderstood.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Why? That's so wild.
Right, runs with the land.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I didn't know that.
So Kelli, great talk as always. My understanding is that there's a surprising amount of pressure when surrounding decisions about residential landscapes that's associated with worrying about what your neighbors think. And our colleagues in Baltimore have done a lot of work on that, where they have shown quite conclusively that people make very different decisions about their front yard than they do about their private backyard. In fact, they call it the mullet hypothesis, right? People care about what you look like from the front. They don't give a damn what you look like in the back. How does that factor into all of this?
Yeah. So we do see backyards, right? People tend to have grass in their backyards because that's where they recreate and that's where they want the function of the turf grass. And so there tends to be, if you have a mix of xeric music, a lot of times the xeric's in the front, the music's in the back. What we have found, and actually, so interestingly, digging through this work, so some early work with Jill Bruman, who actually now works for the city of Scottsdale, showed so what we found is people don't really care what you have, they just want it to be neat and tidy. And they don't want it to encroach on their property type of a thing. So, and by I mean, they don't care what you have, they don't really care if you have lawn or xeric. The exception in the empirical work I've worked on is in some of the historic neighborhoods where there's pressure by the long-term residents because they are now so accustomed to those lush landscapes. It's those folks that if newcomers come into the neighborhood and then want to change away from that historic trend towards more music landscaping, but it's normative pressures. And then in some cases, there's historic overlays that then require you to maintain your palm trees and, the Encanto neighborhood downtown has some other historic overlays intended to maintain the character, the historic character of the communities. And those have to do with especially removing palm trees and the right-of-ways along streets. But yeah, we've seen those functioning more, through informal, neighborly norms and conversations, which is quite common. But we haven't seen some of what work in the Eastern US has shown in terms of lawn-dominant communities having pressure to maintain the hypergreen, monolithic, monospecies of grass lawns to the ideal industrial standard. And so I think and this is where the social-based community marketing approach comes in, because I think like different neighborhoods have different norms. And Joan Nassauer's work has shown this too, is like there are certain communities that are going to prioritize and privilege and encourage people to have more naturalistic landscapes and more trees, and like, don't be taking out that tree, and then there's other landscapes or other neighborhoods where people are going to be pushing the hypergreen monocultural lawn as sort of the yard choice. And so I do think there's an important role in neighborhood dynamics and HOAs. Kelly Turner did some work on HOAs years ago as a PhD student here on that. And that is a big, that's a growing literature that's really interesting. It's really hard to study those because it's really hard to acquire the covenants, codes, and restrictions. And then they're highly variable. So like here, we've seen HOAs that say, you have to have grass, you have to maintain your house. You see HOAs that say you can't have grass. You see HOAs that say, if you have it, you've got to maintain it green year round, right? And so it's like all over the place. But work here showed that HOAs tend to be less water consumptive and actually more biodiverse. And I think that's partly because they are newer areas that tend to have more xeric yards. And so I don't know that it's necessarily the HOAs driving that as much as it is the newer developments have HOAs attached to them. But then that's where, right, because the developers are the ones that are really crafting the original HOAs. And so, but I think that's a super important unit of management, but it's complicated because of it's like private entities. And then, usually aesthetics and the tidiness, and don't make your maintenance of your vegetation a problem from your neighbor. There are issues of encroachment and stuff are the dominant focus of those, not necessarily, environmental goals and outcomes of the landscapes that are in those yards.
So thank you, everyone. We've run out of time. We can't take any more questions. So thank you, Kelli, again for your presentation, and thank you all for your participation in the Q&A. One more round. So have a great afternoon.